Hello, and welcome to Horns of Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, Executive Editor of TNSR. As the Russian war in Ukraine grinds past its 100 days, in addition to the battle occurring on the ground, there's been a battle occurring in the pocketbooks of Russian consumers, producers, and manufacturers. The economic sanctions imposed by the international community have had a dramatic effect on the Russian economy. But how have they affected the Russian war effort? And furthermore, how have they affected Russia's strategic choices? Some insight into this may be provided from an article in Volume 3, Issue 2 of Texas National Security Review entitled Desperate Measures, The Effects of Economic Isolation on Warring Powers. We're joined today by the author of that article, Professor Erik Sand at the United States Naval War College, to discuss his article, The Logic of How Economic Sanctions May Affect Strategic Choices, and how that might reflect on the ongoing conflict. Erik, thanks so much for joining us today. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hey, Doyle. It's great to join you on Horns of the Dilemma here. So as you said, I'm a professor at the U.S. Naval War College in the Strategic and Operational Research Department. My research there focuses on the intersection of economics, security, and strategy, how states manage and attack each other's sources of national power. Obviously, economic isolation is an important part of that. And I have to say, as a faculty member at the Naval War College, the opinions that I express today are my own and don't reflect those of the War College, the U.S. Navy, or the U.S. government.
I appreciate that. Thanks for getting that in. So perhaps just as a start, can you walk us through the main argument of the article and what you're trying to point out there?
Yes. So most scholarship that has looked at blockades or economic isolation has argued that when applied against great powers, they don't work. When those authors ask whether or not sanctions or economic isolations work, they ask the question, do economic isolation, do blockades lead independently those great powers that are being targeted to surrender? And the answer that they come up with is no. But what I suggest is that those scholars have asked the wrong question. The question isn't whether or not economic isolation leads powers to surrender, but rather how it affects their strategies. What I argue is that the economic isolation leads powers to go for riskier strategies than they might otherwise do. And it does this through one of two mechanisms, either a political impact mechanism or a direct impact mechanism. Both of those mechanisms work because economic isolation creates shortages. In a direct impact mechanism, those shortages directly affect the military. There's less military capability, and leaders decide to attack to gain greater resources to continue to support their military campaigns. In the political impact mechanism, those shortages affect the domestic political situation at home and lead to threats to the regime's stability. And in order to try and continue the regime's future, leaders might choose to gamble for resurrection, to go big or go home, to provide more benefits to their population to make up for the hardship that the economic isolation has created.
So when you developed this theory and explored it, the example that you use in the article is the case of Germany in World War I. Can you tell us a little bit about how you found evidence that this affected Germany's strategic choices?
Absolutely. So the British blockade, British economic warfare against Germany in the First World War is one of the most important examples of economic isolation in the 20th century and really that we have in recent history. And when you go back and look at what German leaders said at the time and after the war, they thought that the blockade had enormous impacts on their decisions and on how they chose to fight the war. And in particular, the British blockade really motivated the German decision to unleash unrestricted submarine warfare in late 1916 and early 1917. And this is important because the Germans had tried unrestricted submarine warfare once before in 1915 and early 1916. And the Americans had basically said, if you don't stop doing this, we're going to come into the war against you. And so the German government knew this was a really risky decision, but they decided to do it again in 1916, late 1916, 1917, nonetheless. And what I try and trace is show how the impacts of the blockade creating shortages in Germany affected the German political consensus and drove the German leadership to take this risky decision.
So I'm curious because while the interconnectedness of the global economy is arguably one of the factors that led to World War I, it was also one of the factors that people argued might prevent war. but it is objectively very different from the situation today. Do you think that those differences exacerbate or mitigate the impact of economic sanctions on potential strategic choices?
I think this is one of the most important questions about economic isolation today and how effective it will be. One of the key differences between the first era of globalization that led up to the First World War, and globalization today is how the nature of trade is different. So Germany before the First World War is the second most trading country in the world after Great Britain. And more than 30% of Germany's food and fodder is imported. Germany is a massive exporter of all sorts of production goods. But most trade in the first era of globalization is in raw materials. Whereas today, we have much more integrated supply chains. So it's not just the bauxite or the iron or the food that's being traded, but it's microchips that have been partially, the first step of production is made, but not the end. I think that the nature of globalization today makes it easier for economic isolation to have effects on high-end finished products because you could cut off one component, and if there's that key component is needed for lots of finished products, there's less flexibility in economies to adapt. On the other hand, it might be harder to get to problems with food, though I'm sure we're going to talk about that more, some of those less finished goods. But when it comes to high-end, particularly military capabilities, it's probably easier to interrupt those flows today than it was in the past.
So that also raises a question because many times those high-end technologies are associated with new technologies that arguably may alter the nature of war. And in the First World War, there's sort of two technologies, really three, that came into their prime, one being military aviation, the second being the submarine, and the third being wireless communication. Did the imposition of economic sanctions influence Germany's ability to integrate, employ, and develop those technologies? And if so, how?
Yeah. I think it's tough to assess how the blockade affected the ability to use those technologies. The Germans are very good at using submarines and air power. As I said, a lot of that technological development was happening internally, and the shortages were more in raw materials than in finished goods. But I do think that those two of those three technologies really affected the economic war that happens in two critical ways. First, obviously, there could have been no unrestricted submarine warfare campaign without the development of submarines and submarines that could get out past the British Isles. And I think when we look at the chronology of the war, it's interesting to note that the Battle of Jutland, the major naval battle that happens, is within a month of when the Germans stop unrestricted submarine warfare for the first time. It's within a month of the Sussex Pledge. And so there's a way in which that battle is about trying to break the British blockade, trying to weaken the British Grand Fleet to break the blockade. The other technology that really affects economic warfare is wireless, because wireless means that ships goods on ships can be bought and sold when they're at sea. And so it makes it much harder to understand where goods are actually going based on the bills of lading. And that's a challenge that the British government has to figure out how to overcome over the course of the war.
So that's kind of fascinating because when I think of the parallels with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it strikes me that clearly cyber and internet technologies have a strong analog with the development of wireless. I don't really see an equivalent to submarine technology, although arguably the proven strength of guided anti-tank munitions may be having an effect similar to the development of anti-submarine warfare technology in terms of blunting something that seemed to be very powerful. But another thing that has certainly featured in the Russian attack has been the use of missiles, including hypersonic missiles. And I'm curious whether you foresee any influence on the Russian ability to continue to employ these things based on the economic sanctions.
Absolutely. So I will caveat, I'm not an expert on the Russian war economy. But one thing that is clear is that the Russians are suffering from shortage of microchips as a result of economic sanctions. And microchips are required for precision guided munitions. And we've seen as the war has gone on that the Russians have used fewer precision-guided munitions, and they've resorted more, even just in basic artillery attacks, to mass fire on the front. And I think it's an open question how much of this is a choice and Russian doctrine, and how much of this is the Russians are running low on precision-guided munition stocks, and they can't replace them because they can't get components like microchips to continue to build the guidance packages. And I would expect as the war would drag on, if the Russians can't find a way to make up that source of supply for microchips, that we're going to see some of those higher technology weapons become less and less used by the Russians.
So another thing that strikes me as important here is how economic sanctions influence the duration of a conflict. Because, if I ran out of money tomorrow, I've got credit cards until I don't. And of course, nations have a version of a credit card, which is in some ways more powerful and in some ways more constrained, because the effects of their creditworthiness are felt more rapidly. But at the same time, their ability to just bluster through is perhaps greater than my personal ability to do so. Do you see a relationship between the effect of economic sanctions on strategy and the duration of conflicts, either in terms of, obviously, I think that the fact that sanctions take some time to take effect clearly matters. But conversely, do sanctions make conflicts last longer, or do they hasten their conclusion, or what sort of effect do you see?
So this is a difficult question to answer, in part because, as you said, it takes time for sanctions to take effect. If states are engaging in economic warfare, they're to some extent engaged in a war of attrition. And so that's going to take time. So I would expect that in most conflicts where economic sanctions and economic warfare is going to play an important role, that conflict is already going to last likely years, 2 to 3 years at least. I do think that once you pass that threshold and you're in that attrition war, it's likely that economic isolation is going to shorten the war rather than lengthen it, because that attrition war is about who can survive on their resources the longest. Obviously, part of that is about how much resources you have. And so as economic isolation reduces the amount of resources that one state has, it makes it likely that the war is not going to be able to last as long. Though, of course, the key caveat is we know that resources alone are not a good predictor of war outcomes. Strategy matters a lot, but that's part of the argument in the article, is that resource reduction that economic isolation can have forces more risky strategies. Usually when you're taking bigger risks, things are going to end more quickly because you're making a big play.
The direct mechanism that you describe is one that makes a lot of intuitive sense. If I don't have the stuff I need to build the weapons, I've got to use different weapons or different stuff. The political mechanism is a little bit less intuitive, largely because the examples that we're looking at today, and indeed the example that you looked at, are not regimes that we think of as being enormously sensitive to public pressure. Certainly the Kaiser's Germany was not one in which he woke up every morning looking at the newspaper, wondering how his approval ratings were doing. And I get the sense that Vladimir Putin might be upset if he dipped below 99%, but it's not necessarily an accurate reflection of how things are going. So in an autocratic regime, how does this political mechanism take effect?
So in any regime, the leadership of that regime needs support from somebody in order to stay in power. Political scientists call this group the selectorate, but that's just a fancy word for the people whose support you need to stay in power. So when we look at Germany leading up to the First World War, this group of people who needs to support the Kaiser and the imperial German state is relatively small. The Kaiser, I won't get into too many details here, but Germany had a very complex political structure, and the Kaiser's real base of power was from his role as the king of Prussia. And the Prussian state and the Prussian elite are really the group that dominates imperial Germany. And though there were elections that occurred in Prussia, really about 25% of the people who were eligible to vote controlled about 85% of the seats within the Prussian parliament. So this small group had a large outside influence, and that group was mostly landed elite, the Junkers of the Prussian elite. And what happens during the war is the hardships induced by the blockade, and particularly food shortages, create a lot of social discontent between this Prussian elite and the German working class. And it happens in two ways. First, there's a huge black market for food because German internal food management is really bad. It's so bad that the German army has to buy food on the black market in order to feed the troops on the front. And the rich can buy food on the black market, and the working class looks at this and they're like, these rich people, they're not suffering in the war just like the rest of us are. Meanwhile, the rich are looking at the food rationing system, which prioritizes industrial workers to keep them strong for the war fight. They're saying, hey, these workers are getting more than we're getting. We don't think that reflects our status. And it really starts to break the political compromise that had allowed the Prussian system to continue. And so the landed elite in Germany basically, or I should say the leadership in Germany, comes to believe that the landed elite won't support them unless they get a big win from the war, right? If the war ends, basically with Germany's borders being the way they were before, they're not going to be able to pay off people for all this hardship. And if they don't do that, then the working class is going to demand way more rights. And so the German government decides, unless we can have a really big win, even if we have a negotiated peace, we're probably going to have major social upheaval at home. And that to them is almost worse than losing the war. And so they decide to take this big bet on unrestricted submarine warfare.
So, yeah, I think that's kind of interesting because obviously, you don't think of Russian oligarchs as suffering from food shortage, and indeed even having to switch to domestic caviar is not a bad thing for them. But it is fascinating how it may work through second and third order effects in order to influence, we have the examples of the seizures of mega yachts and things like that are one case, but there still is a day-to-day life in Russia that presumably is exerting some type of pressure on the oligarchs in terms of it being different than it was before as they deal with those things. Oftentimes, and in part because of the research you mentioned at the beginning of the episode about the relative ineffectiveness of economic sanctions in compelling defeat or victory, sanctions are thought of as a measure less stringent than strong military effort. But there's a little bit of a counterintuitive argument put forth prominently in the same example that you used by historian Adam Lambert in his book, Planning for Armageddon. And I think you and your colleague Suzanne Freeman made a similar argument in March in War on the Rocks that basically argues that sanctions run the risk of doing what Sun Tzu would call putting your opponent on death ground. Can you tell me a little bit about that and whether and how that might be manifesting in this case, and then how that affects the calculation on the part of both the power imposing sanctions and the escalation calculations on the part of the sanctioned party?
So to understand this argument about how economic sanctions and economic isolation can put someone on death ground, we have to think about the mechanism by which sanctions are supposed to have their effect, or blockade are supposed to have their effect. And there have generally been two arguments about this. The traditional argument is that the blockade or economic sanctions against the power at war, they just sort of wear down a little bit the military power that they can put in the field, and that because they have less combat power, they're likely to lose. But there's another logic, and this is indeed the logic that underlies most economic sanctions in peacetime. And there's a political scientist named Nikolai Marinov who has written about this. And the logic that underlies coercive economic sanctions in peacetime is that the suffering that economic sanctions will create will increase the risk that the government that is being targeted will face domestic political overthrow, whether that's through elections or through a revolution. And while the sanctions may or may not lead to that overthrow, the increased risk of that will make the leadership more likely to change its position on the issue. And when one thinks about that argument, essentially what we're saying is economic sanctions, economic isolation, the goal is to overthrow or increase the risk of overthrow of the target government. And so that's an essential interest of any government, is to stay in power. And if the strategy you're pursuing could lead them to lose power if it's effective, they're likely going to do anything that they can to try and stop that.
So when we are looking at sanctioning a nuclear power, such as Vladimir Putin's Russia, is there a legitimate concern that the sanctions may be constraining his strategic choices such that he might turn to threats of nuclear force or potentially even the use of nuclear force, whether that be in the escalate to de-escalate model or some other, at a lower threshold than he would otherwise?
I think that's right. So the argument I make in the Texas National Security Review piece is that economic sanctions can lead powers to pursue riskier strategies. Now, before the nuclear era, that means they launch offensives in directions that they might not otherwise have launched, or they do things like unrestricted submarine warfare. But in the nuclear age, right, you can always reach to unsheath that nuclear sword. I think that this is one of the key differences about economic sanctions, in a nuclear war. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that we should never reach for economic sanctions against a nuclear power. Thomas Schelling argues that all sort of nuclear crises are about a competition in risk-taking. But what's really important to realize is that economic sanctions are ratcheting up that level of risk that nuclear weapons might be used, and to factor that into our calculations of what we're doing.
So there's an old famous saying about if you throw a frog into a pot of boiling water, he will hop right out. Whereas if you put him in the pot and you turn the heat on underneath, he will remain there and slowly cook. I'm not sure what the Institutional Review Board looked like for that experiment, or if it's actually been validated. Don't know. But it raises the question, with a measure that takes effect over time, such as sanctions, is the person who is being sanctioned, or the state being sanctioned, likely to recognize that their strategic choices are narrowing and that they are narrowing because of the sanctions? Or is it more likely, and perhaps did it happen in the German, or you see evidence of it happening in the Russian case, that they may not recognize in real time what's going on to them? They may simply be saying, these are the choices I have, and not really taking a look at whether those choices might be broadened by somehow easing the pressure of the sanctions.
This is a really interesting question. I think it's much easier for us to look back retrospectively and try and make these causal arguments than it might even be for the players in real time. For one thing, the Germans, they heap a lot of hate on the blockade during the First World War. And there's a big debate among historians about how much the food shortages that occur in Germany are about the results of the blockade and how much it's just the Germans are really bad at managing food internally. Obviously, I come down on the side that both matter, but that you wouldn't have had these problems without the blockade being there. That said, I do think that at some point, if the state is relatively effective, that leaders are going to see that the constraints that economic isolation imposes, even if they're not directly tying them to economic isolation. Though, if anything, I think they're more likely to tie them to economic isolation than not. And that comes down particularly to shortages and stockpiles, right? So it's easier to see this sort of in the military example. But if I know that I have 6 months of oil left for combat operations, and I'm not bringing in enough oil to build up that stockpile, then I can watch every day my oil stocks go down. And I know that I'm on a clock. And it's actually that window for action that I think helps create this incentive to take riskier decisions. Now, in the political mechanism, it's a little harder. As you say, it's a cumulative strategy. It's like the frog in boiling water. How much stress will the population be able to take? That's much more difficult to calculate. But I do think that if things start to get bad, leaders start to see it. In Germany, in the First World War, there were food riots in dozens of cities across Germany over 1916. There was clear unrest that there was going to be domestic, and there were domestic political problems.
And of course, in the Russian case, it's complicated by the fact that the sanctions imposed on Russia as a result of the Ukraine invasion are more stringent, but they are not new in terms of Russia being sanctioned, even being sanctioned for actions in Ukraine. The sanctions following the shootdown of the Malaysian airliner have been in place for several years now. I'm curious whether you see any indication that this might just have reset their baseline of what is normal, and if so, how that might be affecting their calculus in looking at strategic options.
So right now, the sanctions are clearly affecting the Russians, but I don't think they're driving the Russians to take riskier strategies than they otherwise would. In fact, when we look at how Vladimir Putin has twice sort of reduced the aims of the Russian war in Ukraine, backing away from the thrust towards Kyiv and the thrust towards Kharkiv, those are the opposite of escalatory decisions, rolling back his goals. And similarly, the reporting that has come out just in the past week about how the Russians are preparing for a long-term campaign seems to think that Vladimir Putin doesn't think he's on a clock. And normally, those constraints that shortages create and economic isolation creates put a leader on the clock, and that's what forces them to take those riskier decisions. That said, it often takes a year or two for sanctions and economic isolation to really have an effect. So the question would be a year from now or a year and a half from now, does Vladimir Putin feel as comfortable as he does today about the long-term view of the war?
So that question of the duration it takes to kick in, I think it's an interesting one as it affects the ability to modulate what you're doing as the party imposing sanctions. You and I both share an experience as naval officers and ship drivers. And one of the lessons that was hard for me to learn as an ensign figuring out how to drive a ship was that if I did something and I didn't see the effect, I needed to wait because it did have an effect. I just hadn't seen it yet because I was moving several thousand tons of steel with a control mechanism that was somewhat remote and acted only in one domain. I think there's a reasonable analogy to be made here to the imposition of sanctions. And so I guess my question is, do we properly view them as a blunt instrument, as a scalpel? How much control do we have and how do we modulate the influence of sanctions in order to drive an adversary toward desired behaviors?
I really like your analogy of driving a ship and economic sanctions. I think anyone who pictures an aircraft carrier trying to turn or a very large tanker ship would see that ship turning very slowly. And I think that's exactly the right analogy for sanctions. One of my concerns early in the conflict was how rapidly we were placing additional sanctions on the Russians without necessarily seeing what those effects were going to be. And I think, to your point, this means that sanctions are more of a hammer, right? Because there's this very long lead time before you have sanctions taken back. Earlier, I said a year or two. That's sort of an estimate, right? You can imagine a situation where the stockpiles are already low, and small changes in sanctions mean within months that you can have problems, especially if you've been sanctioned heavily for some period of time. The one way in which you could maybe attempt to be more precise is if you target particular resources, right? One can imagine a strategy where if you know that a very sort of Machiavellian strategy where if you know that there's a particular type of resource that a state needs to import and there's a neutral country right next door that you really want to bring it on your side, that you just try and sanction that resource to try and get your target state to go invade that state and bring them in on your side. But I'm not sure how heavily I would weight the possibility that one could be successful in that application. And even that's a pretty crude application of the
Your article in TNSR, as we've said, uses the example of Germany in World War I. And it's a terrific example for illustrating your argument. I think it is evocative. There's a wealth of information that's available to it. It's really, really useful. But I'm going to guess that you considered other cases as you looked at the article. And I'm curious how strongly we see this effect in other cases. And when I take this in the aggregate of all the historical examples, what lessons we can take about the strength and the durability of this approach.
Yeah. So there are two other examples from the Second World War, Germany in the Second World War, Japan in the Second World War, that also sort of have similar impacts. You could do the reverse, and you could look at the German attempts at economic isolation against Great Britain with the submarine campaigns in both the First and Second World Wars. So those are much less effective at creating shortages, and so we never get to the point of seeing effectiveness. The other major examples that we have of wartime blockades go back to the Napoleonic Wars in the 18th and early 19th centuries. I have looked at those briefly, but not with enough depth to see all of the implications. Though certainly we do see states coming into that fight that weren't there before, and states taking risky decisions. So, for example, the British decision to attack the then neutral Danish fleet at the Battle of Copenhagen is driven by the dynamics of Napoleon's continental system and the British blockade. The other place where I think have seen a little bit of this behavior more recently is looking at the maximum pressure campaign against Iran. And back in 2018 and 2019, as sanctions against Iran were really being turned up again, we saw the Iranians taking more aggressive actions than we had seen previously. Publicly, there were the attacks on the tankers in the UAE with limpet mines that gained a lot of attention at that time. So I do think we see other examples of where economic pressure can lead the target state to act in a more risky way.
So you mentioned the effort on the part of the Germans to economically isolate Britain during World War II through the use of submarine warfare, which, though not successful in the long run, certainly posed a dramatic risk to the British economy, to the British war effort. What ultimately doomed the German effort was the scale of the Allied resupply effort and the persistence of the Allies despite taking losses in doing this. But leaving aside that, which is a fascinating story and a story of great heroism, and, I'll have to put in another plug for the movie Greyhound, since everyone is going after Top Gun. I would really say, Greyhound is another terrific World War II movie with, good stuff there. But it highlights the degree to which external support changes the calculus when one starts taking a look at economic isolation. While Europe and the West have been relatively united in their sanctions regime against Russia, China continues to support Russia, and other states continue to do business with Russia, albeit perhaps a little bit at a lesser level than they did before. How do you see that affecting the impact, the influence of sanctions on the strategic choices available to Russia?
So first, as a wannabe historian, I have to make a little bit of historical commentary. I agree that it was the scale of the Allied response to Britain that mattered, but also the Allies' ability to implement new technologies that made their anti-submarine warfare much more effective mattered tremendously. Outside support is a hugely important factor, and it's not just in the current war. It's not just a major factor for Russia. It's obviously a major factor for Ukraine. When we look at Ukraine's inability to export goods, the Ukrainian economy has collapsed, and it is virtually, and it is the West that is supporting the Ukrainian economy. And there's a parallel in the Second World War with Allied support for the Soviet Union, which makes a huge difference in the Soviets' ability to pursue more aggressive strategies against the Russians or the Germans that involve maybe less risk. I think the really interesting question about Chinese support for Russia is how tepid it has been thus far. The Washington Post reported, I think, just today about how careful the Chinese have been, how they've said no to some Russian requests, that the Chinese are worried about the application of secondary sanctions by the West on China. And so the Chinese are trying to do everything they can to support the Russians without triggering stronger pushback against their own economy from the West. That said, if the Chinese, and sanctions regimes always evolve over time, states that are the targets get better at finding ways around them, And states that are imposing the sanction regimes or the economic isolation have to find ways to sort of cut off those paths. And so there's a competition there. But if the Russians and the Chinese come up with better ways to funnel more support to the Russians, that could go a huge distance towards alleviating some of the problems that we've seen. But I think it's hard to predict the trajectory that will take, because it will depend both on the policy decisions and that are made by Russia and China, but also by the United States and the West.
So you spoke about the way in which the political mechanism exerts pressure on the regime of the targeted state. One of the things we see, though, whenever there is talk of sanctions, is that there is a political mechanism that works in the other direction, exerting pressure on the regimes of states that are implementing the sanctions. I'm curious whether you saw evidence of that in the First World War or in any of the other examples you discussed, and if so, whether or how those influenced the effectiveness and the type of sanctions that were imposed.
100%. So we mentioned Planning Armageddon, Lambert's book earlier, which provides a detailed history of Britain's pre-war planning for economic isolation against Germany, and then the war itself through about 1916. And what Lambert makes clear is that the British thought that they were going to launch this economic warfare against Germany, and the war was going to end really quickly because the German economy was going to collapse. And that doesn't happen right at the start of the war in 1914. And part of the reason that doesn't happen is because of all the resistance that the Admiralty faces in this plan, both from within the British government and from overseas, and particularly the United States. We forget that relations between the United States and Britain become very sour in 1915 because of the way that the British are trying to stop American trade with Germany. And even British trade with Germany in some ways continues for a while through the war. And it's not until 1916 that the British get really serious. They create a Ministry of Economic Warfare to try and push really hard on neutrals to rein this in. And Russia is deliberately, I think, trying to do the same thing now. When Suzanne and I wrote in War on the Rocks, we made 4 predictions about how sanctions could affect the Russians. And some of those we definitely got wrong, like that the Russians might go to seize parts of the Ukrainian defense industrial base. The second one we made is that Vladimir Putin might try to do economic warfare in return, that he might try and cut off food exports from Ukraine, which is a major food exporter, that 60% of, I think, world neon production, which is used in microchip production, is exported through Odessa. And indeed, we're seeing exactly that. And it is perhaps becoming clear that part of Vladimir Putin's strategy is it's okay if the war on the ground in Ukraine goes slowly. We think we can impose economic warfare in return against the West and the globe more broadly through food shortages, which might create a migrant crisis, through inflation and high energy prices, and that he thinks he might be able to hold out longer than the West can hold out against those economic, his reciprocal economic warfare.
And, that's interesting because the conflicts in which the United States has been involved for the last 20 years have ultimately not been decided on the battlefield. They have been decided as battles of political will. And I think that trend can be traced back further through the Vietnam War and arguably through the Korean War that preceded it. And so it's an interesting question of, in the case of conflicts in which the United States is directly involved, the political will is sapped by sort of a slow attrition strategy and the creation of unacceptable conditions. But in a conflict where the United States isn't involved, it may be the effort to sap political will by increasing the financial costs and making it inconvenient. And I think anyone who's gone to fuel their car within the past month can identify that, it is certainly having some effect.
Yeah. Yes. One of the other major differences between the war in Ukraine and previous examples is that for both Russia and the West, though not for Ukraine, this is still a limited war. Right? The Russians so far have deliberately avoided mobilizing their army and mobilizing their economy, and the West has not done so either. And in these other examples of economic warfare, which, as we've said earlier, are really battles of attrition, we've seen the states mobilize for total war. We're talking 40 to 80% of GDP being directed towards the war effort. So there's real sort of struggle to keep up with the competition. And it's an open question as to whether in these limited wars where it's not an all-out state effort, how much does economic isolation have that immediate effect? Or would states say, all right, well, before I cave here, I can just put a little bit more effort towards the war? This gets to this fundamental question about limited war, which is when would a state ever quit fighting a war when it still has means to fight a little bit harder?
So I'd like to wrap up as we approach the end of our time by asking you a terribly unfair question, which is, with the hindsight of having a contemporary example that to a degree tests the theory and the observations that you put forward in your article, how do you think your theory is holding up? And if you were to write the article today, what, if anything, would you change in light of what we're seeing in Ukraine?
So I'll take the easy answer to that unfair question is it's too soon to tell what the answer is. But if you were to tell me that peace was made in Ukraine tomorrow, then I think that this example, the war so far, would be counter to the argument that we make. Because as I said, the Russians have a couple of times reduced the goals towards which they were fighting, which is not taking more risk. It's reducing the risk that they are taking. But I'm also not sure the sanctions have gotten to the point where they're really constraining Russian operations. And so I think to fairly test the theory, we have to get to a point where the sanctions are really constraining what the Russians are able to do on the battlefield. And once we get to that point, that's really when we could test whether the theory is right.
Excellent. We've been speaking with Professor Erik Sand, who is the author of Desperate Measures, The Effects of Economic Isolation on Warring Powers, which can be found in Volume 3, Issue 2 of Texas National Security Review. He's also the author, along with Suzanne Freeman, of The Russian Sanctions Regime and the Risk of Catastrophic Success, a March 8, 2022 article from War on the Rocks. Erik, it's been really a pleasure talking with you, and I think it's been illuminating in terms of both what we've seen thus far and perhaps what it is that we might expect. Thanks so much for joining us. I really appreciate it. Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.